President Trump telling North Korea, get your act together, as he doubles down on his warnings to Kim Jong-un to stop threatening the United States and its allies. Mr. Trump saying just this morning, America's military solutions are in place. And today, he's meeting with Secretary of State Rex Tillerson and National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster, as well as UN Ambassador Nikki Haley. This is Outnumbered. I'm Sandra Smith, and here today from the Fox Business Network, Dagan McDowell. Also from FBN, anchor of the Intelligence Report, Trish Regan. Former national security staffer under President Bush and Obama, Jillian Turner. And today's hashtag One Lucky Guy. Iraq and Afghanistan veteran and Fox News contributor Pete Hegseth is here, and he is outnumbered, and you made it by the hair of your chinny chin chin. You are filling in for Mr. Kilmeade up in radio. You were just with me on his
radio program. We had
so much fun, yeah.
So glad to be here. Barely made it.
But I know that you are so fired up about what is happening right now.
I called you hunky in the tease, by the way. I know you missed it.
I really appreciate that. You're embarrassing.
All right, let's get started.
One of these days.
President Trump, doubling down on his threat to unleash fire and fury in North Korea, continues to threaten the U.S. after Pyongyang announced possible plans to launch missiles toward the U.S. territory of Guam. Reporters asking the president if his initial tone was too harsh. Listen.
Frankly, the people that were questioning that statement, was it too tough? Maybe it wasn't tough enough. If North Korea does anything in terms of even thinking about attack of anybody that we love or we represent or our allies or us, they can be very, very nervous. I'll tell you what, and they should be very nervous, because things will happen to them like they never thought possible, okay?
And this morning, President Trump tweeting this: military solutions are now fully in place, locked and loaded, should North Korea act unwisely. Hopefully, Kim Jong-un will find another path. North Korea's state news agency saying today Trump is driving the situation to, quote, the brink of a nuclear war. Meantime, Defense Secretary James Mattis telling reporters diplomacy is the way forward.
The American effort is diplomatically led. It has diplomatic traction. It is gaining diplomatic results. And I want to stay right there, right now. The tragedy of war is well enough known. It doesn't need another characterization beyond the fact that it would be catastrophic.
First, the rhetoric from the president. Fire and fury. Then he says those words may not have been tough enough.
Then he says locked and loaded. This is a guy who understands tough talk is what's needed right now. You need the credible threat of military force, which we never had under Barack Obama and have barely had ever in North Korea. So we've diplomated, we've sanctioned, we've UN regulationed our way to a nuclear bomb where now we're under threat on our own shore. Play this forward 20 years. In 20 years, we could face perpetual blackmail from the Korean Peninsula. Not a couple missiles, not a dozen, hundreds of missiles, miniaturized nuclear weapons pointed at our cities, undermining our ability to operate in that region or around the globe. And the same could happen in Iran. This is a put up or shut up moment. This is a serious president with serious people around him. His instincts are right. Soft talk has not worked. Strength is the only one that's going to work. We've done nothing but bad deals in that area. It's time to force the North Korean regime and China, who he's also speaking to, by the way, most importantly, to come to the table and stop it now.
So he's doubled down on the tough talk, but then there's concern about this mixed messaging that may or may not be coming out of the White House, with Defense Secretary Mattis, as you just heard, saying we want to use diplomacy, saying a potential nuclear confrontation with North Korea would be catastrophic. Are the messages mixed coming out of this White House?
I don't think the messages are mixed, meaning they're not contradicting one another. I think that Secretary Mattis naturally has a much more measured way of speaking than President Trump. That's just, they have very different rhetorical styles, but I think they're synced up on policy underneath that. And I think that, by the way, I was saying this to Pete yesterday on the Business Channel, that President Trump's approach so far, in my opinion, is not hugely divergent from President Obama. What we've got is, since basically the policy has not changed that much.
Except the credible use of military force.
Well, but Pete, to correct you, though, on earlier, President Obama increased the American troop presence in South Korea.
Never a credible threat of military force.
But he increased the number of American troops in South Korea. So how can you say that there was no
first strike capability?
credible military force?
We weren't going to do a land invasion into North Korea. It's the credible use of a first strike capability.
But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about having the threat be visible to the North Koreans, having the threat be immediate immediate, having the threat be in close proximity, how else do you convey that aside from having military there?
All right. Well, there is one group taking issue with the rhetoric coming out of the White House, Dagan, and that is Democrats. There is an excerpt that we have from this letter signed by 64 House Dems condemning his language, urging Rex Tillerson to rein in that rhetoric, saying this in the letter: "These statements are irresponsible and dangerous, and also senselessly provide a boon to domestic North Korean propaganda. We respectfully but firmly urge you to do everything in your power to ensure that President Trump and other administration officials understand the importance of speaking and acting with the utmost caution and restraint on this delicate issue."
Caution and restraint have not worked. What do they want? Warm and fuzzy. Come on over here and let me give you a big hug kind of language. This is communist-style language that should resonate with the Kim regime. And even President Clinton back in 1994 discussed or thought about at least the threat of military action and was really talked away by President Jimmy Carter, and then we put in place something that had no checks and balances in terms of what the North Korea was allowed to do. There are a lot of things at issue. We have diplomacy. We have at least signals from the president and his advisors that we are at the ready to shoot down missiles. We are at the ready with military presence, but there's so many other things we can do. The CIA, Mike Pompeo has been talking for weeks about preparing for the North Korea threat, including covert operations in the country potentially. We can up our missile defenses. The Trump budget actually reduces the funding for missile defense systems in this country. Anti-proliferation dragnets, which the Bush administration used, where we would actually board ships if we think that they're carrying nuclear material. There's so much that we can do, and so much that's being talked about.
And as far as further sanctions, which we've talked a lot about on this couch, and we talked about it this morning, Pete, Colonel Oliver North was on Fox News earlier saying the problem with sanctions, they take too darn long.
I know. I mean, you know what? We should have sanctioned the heck out of North Korea a long time ago. We should have sanctioned the heck out of China, and we still should. I mean, there's a lot of opportunity. This is low-hanging fruit we're talking about. We sanctioned one bank from China recently, but there's a whole lot more that are doing business here, and we should be going after China hard to demand that they play ball on North Korea. As far as the rhetoric goes, this is a crazy man. He might as well know that we can do what we say we do in terms of the rhetoric itself. There is nothing wrong with conveying what we have. Lord knows we don't want to get to that state. But if he doesn't know that we're serious, then he will not take us seriously. And this has been the whole problem with the last administration.
That's right. And that's why doubling down on sanctions at this point, while it may help bring China along, isn't going to solve whether he pursues or ultimately. He already has them, but how many miniaturized nukes he gets. The lesson that dictators take is that if you give up your nukes, you die in a ditch, stabbed by your own people, like Muammar Gaddafi. He gave up his nukes after the Iraq War, and that's what happened to him. They believe the pursuit of those will preserve their regime, which is why stopping them before they get them or can produce proliferate them is so critically important. And again, I go back to Iran, because Iran is even worse. It's an ideologically dedicated place that said they wanted to wipe Israel off the map. They're collaborating with North Korea to get these very same weapons. Imagine when we're under perpetual blackmail from these two states, an axis of evil that we haven't understood.
We're talking about preventing countries like preventing North Korea from development is OBE now. I don't know why we even talk about that. I get that it's important to talk about whose fault all of this may be.
And how bad it would be.
I agree 100%. But I think that it's more important to look at what's on the table right now, because that's what President Trump's looking at. And I think he's exercising his own this is his own version of amped up strategic deterrence. He's not changing the policy so much because he's kind of maneuvered that as much as he can right now without launching a ground invasion inside North Korea. So what he's doing is amping up the rhetoric.
But
I think it's important.
And is it important?
That's a stylistic difference. It's not a policy.
So do you agree with Susan Rice, who wrote in the New York Times yesterday that we need to tolerate nuclear weapons in North Korea? That's just the way it's going to be? We've got to deal with it forever?
I never said anything even remotely like that.
No, but that's effectively what you're saying. Is that
no, it's not. It's absolutely not.
Okay, so clarify your comments then.
All I'm saying is that everybody's making a big deal as if President Trump's stance on this issue is tremendously divergent from presidents that have come before him. And I'm simply pointing out that if you look at what's on the ground, it's actually not. He's changing the rhetoric. He's not actually doing anything differently than, say, what President Obama did right now. That's my point. I'm not saying we need to tolerate North Korea as a nuclear state.
The sanctions at the United Nations over the weekend, although they did not go far enough, $1 billion out of $3 billion in exports coming out of North Korea, the fact that China and Russia signed on to those is the very reason that you're seeing so much jawboning from Kim Jong-un at this point. The fact that they sanctioned that small bank, the Bank of Dandong, in late June, it was kind of overlooked by a lot of the media before the missile, Kim firing the missiles in July. But that's a big step because it signals that more is to come.
If you make these threats, and we're making these threats now, do you run a situation where you may have this red line? We all remember that well. And if you don't, I mean, the challenge, I think, with rhetoric, and this is perhaps why other presidents haven't used this, and I hear your point that the policy necessarily hasn't changed, but now that you're out there saying these things, what does that mean if he decides to go and lob those things into the water off Guam?
That's where President Trump has been so responsible, where Obama was so reckless. He isn't setting red lines. He's been very careful not to say this is the exact trigger point, because that's when you force yourself, you back yourself into a corner where you got to do something you don't want to do, or you look foolish like Obama did in Syria by setting that red line and then not enforcing it.
Here's the problem.
So President Trump's taking a very responsible approach, and brinksmanship is part of how you get a good outcome, which is exactly what he's doing right now.
Really quickly, here's a problem with our missile interceptors, broadly speaking. They're called mid-course ground-based intercepts. We have mixed success with those, about a 50% success rate over their lifetime. So if you shoot missiles and we don't get all of them, then what?
All right, we've got to leave it there. More on this coming up as tensions escalate. China's state media warning North Korea and the U.S. not to play with fire. But President Trump calling out Beijing, saying it must do more to rein in its nuclear neighbor. Whether the U.S. can truly pressure China for help. Plus, President Trump now suggesting Mitch McConnell should step down if he fails to deliver on key agenda items. Good way to hold him accountable, or is he alienating a key ally? We will debate.
I think China can do a lot more, yes. China can, and I think China will do a lot more. Look, we have trade with China. We lose hundreds of billions of dollars a year on trade with China. They know how I feel. It's not going to continue like that. But if China helps us, I feel a lot differently for trade. A lot differently for trade.
That was President Trump yesterday, stepping up pressure on China to do more to help resolve the standoff in North Korea. But Beijing says both countries shouldn't play with fire, and also suggesting it will block any preemptive attacks on North Korea. The Global Times, a Chinese state-run newspaper, writing, quote, China should also make clear that if North Korea launches missiles that threaten U.S. soil first and the U.S. retaliates, China will stay neutral. If the U.S. and South Korea carry out strikes and try to overthrow the North Korean regime and change the political pattern of the Korean peninsula, China will prevent them from doing so. Meantime, a Chinese foreign ministry spokesman today calling the situation complex, but urging both sides to take steps to de-escalate the situation. All right, so let's start here with China. What is China's role in all of this?
It's substantial. I actually think you have to escalate before you de-escalate. Escalate sufficiently to create a crisis moment, brinksmanship, where they have to come to the table based on shared interests. They want to agitate with North Korea, but they don't want to create such an agitation that the regime is overthrown or America gains more of a foothold on that peninsula. Where is that rub? Where does that point meet? I'm not quite sure. That's for the experts in the White House to determine. But you have to push that envelope because China, they're not interested in our interests. They're also not our friends. They have their own ambitions regionally, in their hemisphere, and globally. They look toward a long future where they're ascendant and America is descendant. That is the view of the Chinese leadership right now over a 50-year perspective. They're building islands. They're projecting power. This is part of that game that they're playing. And being decisive with them, standing strong, using trade as a lever is going to be key.
Dagan appears in agreement. Jillian's trying to jump in. Dagan, to you first.
No, I was just going to add that China hopes that the North Korea threat drives us out of Northeast Asia. And there is so much more that we can do in terms of putting financial pressure on China and on North Korea. What the UN sanctions over the weekend did not do, they did not cut the supply of oil and refined oil products, gasoline, into North Korea from China. Yeah. The export of slave labor that sends money back to the Hermit Kingdom. And then in terms of the secondary sanctions, you start cracking down, as Trish was talking about in the last block, you start cracking down on financial institutions, any companies that are propping up the missile and nuclear programs in China. You make it hurt. You make China hurt in their pocketbook, and it could affect.
So did you hear what he said? That was very interesting. He said, look, we have to go after China on a lot of these issues, i.e. trade, et cetera. But, maybe I'll back off is essentially what he was saying. If they cooperate on North Korea, you think about China, they are stealing from American companies hundreds of billions of dollars worth of intellectual property. They're counterfeiting goods. I mean, they are just a source for counterfeit goods, unlike any other. And this is costing American businesses. And it's a big issue because not only that, you run the risk as a foreign company doing business in China that your executives can be jailed for really drummed up charges. So there are a lot of issues with China. We need to start addressing these. And that is, I suppose, our leverage, Dagan, right? That is the threat that we have. We can actually start going after them on all of these economic issues, but we haven't done it, Jillian. I'm not sure why.
Well, I think part of the reason, and Pete touched on it a moment ago too, part of the reason is that we share with North Korea a common interest in having a nuclear-free. We share with China an interest in having a nuclear-free North Korea, but that is a relationship based on convenience and only goes up to a point, and then we sharply diverge. So our national security interests in this are much stronger than China's, because China, remember, is a neighbor and looks to North Korea for major trade, major investment, props them up. They have a vested interest in seeing North Korea's economy remain strong, remain stable, and remain independent. The North Korean economy collapsing would prevent a major, major crisis for China. For us, not so much.
So should President Trump be trying to convince China to do more to address this threat?
Well, he has been, and I think every American president comes into office and they think, okay, I'm going to hit China really hard. I'm going to go down that path as far as I can, and maybe I'll be the one to turn it, and they're not. And it's because, again, our interests, our national security interests, get to a certain point and then sharply diverge. And I don't know how we're ever going to overcome that.
And financially and economically, we don't have as much leverage over China as some people think. One, because we do rely on imported goods from China to keep, because people love cheap goods that they buy at discount stores, number one. I don't mean to sound simplistic about this. And also, China being the second largest foreign holder of our debt, because we are a debtor nation, we rely on them to not only continue to buy U.S. Treasuries, but to not sell what they own to keep interest rates down.
They're our banker, and yet simultaneously, China needs us to do well because they need that debt to actually get repaid.
Yeah.
All right, we got to leave
and
it
they need
there.
someone to sell to.
And as the tensions continue to mount with North Korea, a must-see interview this weekend. Chris Wallace will talk to CIA Director Mike Pompeo on Fox News Sunday. Check your local listings for channel and time on the Fox Broadcast Network, and you can catch it Sunday at 2 p.m. Eastern right here on FNC. Well, the growing showdown between President Trump and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, and what it means for the president's stalled agenda on Capitol Hill. Plus, two of President Trump's biggest Republican critics in the Senate now facing primary challengers. Should other Trump critics be worried? And is it time for more Republicans to support the president?